Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
We've got a really good topic and a really good speaker today, and I think she brought most of her staff, but Libby Skarin, is that right? Skarin, who is the policy director for the ACLU of South Dakota. She's here to update you on some of their projects right now and what's going on. One more just quick thing. Sioux Empire Fair is coming up. We got a booth to fill. I'm going to pass a note around if anybody wants to volunteer for a time to be at the booth. Okay.
Hi everyone, I'm Libby Skarin. I am the policy director at the ACLU of South Dakota. I have been in South Dakota for a few years now. I grew up in Sioux City, Iowa. Then I went to the University of Iowa for undergrad and stuck around for law school. I practiced law for a couple of years in my hometown. I jumped on board with the ACLU team in 2014 and we've been full speed ahead ever since. My role as the policy director is to run our policy and advocacy program, and I also act as our full-time lobbyist during the legislative session in Pierre every year. You know, we've been here at Forum before several times, so I don't want to take too much time talking about the ACLU as a national organization and the history of the organization, because I think you've heard us talk about that before. But in case anyone doesn't know exactly what we do, our mission is to defend and preserve the civil rights and civil liberties guaranteed to everyone in South Dakota under our state and federal constitutions. Thank you. We think it's important. We do this work in the state legislature, we do it in courts, as well as in communities. We are a nonprofit and a nonpartisan organization. Some people laugh at that, but I mean it when I say it. We don't officially affiliate with Democrats or Republicans or independent parties. We really value our neutrality and focus on working on issues, not on candidates or parties. We take on pretty much all civil rights and civil liberties issues. We work on a vast array of things. Just to give you a taste of that, some of the issues we work on are capital punishment, disability rights, mass incarceration, privacy, racial justice, religious liberty, reproductive freedom, including the right to access abortion, and voting rights. Today I want to talk about a couple things. First, our priorities in South Dakota and sort of how they've changed over the past few years. We're really focusing on our criminal justice work, especially within the context of the Attorney General's race. So to explain that a little bit, I want to talk about our Smart Justice campaign, you know, what the heck we mean when we say Smart Justice and how we're doing this work. I also want to talk a little bit about how we're ramping up our community outreach efforts and our volunteering program. And I'm timing myself. I'm planning to talk from 20 to 25 minutes because I want to make sure to save some time to answer any questions any of you might have about what I talk about today or our work generally. So our priorities in South Dakota, like I said, we work on a lot of different issues, but we've found that by setting a few top priorities, that really helps us focus our work and enables some long-term planning for us to map out our vision and be strategic about how we make South Dakota a better place for everyone. We've been working on three major priorities for the past few years: LGBT rights, reproductive rights, and criminal justice. I think what a lot of people around here have known us for over the past few years is our work on LGBT, particularly anti-transgender legislation that we've seen at the state capitol. That is definitely still a part of our program, but lately in the past few months and for the next few months and years, we're really going to be focusing on the criminal justice system. We have made criminal justice reform our top priority, and we are focusing most of our efforts on that work. Of course, that doesn't mean that we're leaving anything else behind, but we really feel that right now is a critical time for criminal justice in South Dakota. And that's why we are launching what we're calling our Smart Justice campaign. So what the heck is Smart Justice? Smart Justice to us is a way of addressing criminal justice issues that solves the problems of crime rather than just punishing people and locking them up. We want to create a system that addresses the profound connections of crime to mental health and addiction, employment, education, and housing. Our vision of Smart Justice doesn't spend money on ineffective responses to crime. Instead, we want to clear out clogged courtrooms and overcrowded jails and prisons. We want to empower communities while also keeping them safe. And we want our government to implement policies that actually improve safety through proven approaches and to reduce crime and recidivism. We think that our criminal justice system is broken in this country and in this state. Today, more than 2.2 million people are in American jails and prisons. Nearly 4.7 million people are on probation and parole, and nearly 70 million are living with a criminal record. Back in 1978, South Dakota housed about 500 inmates. Over the last 40 years, however, that number has increased by more than 700%. Our state's prison numbers have grown at a rate of about 30 times the state's overall population increase during that same period. South Dakota actually imprisons more people per capita than every single state that we border. South Dakota's incarceration rate is about 855 per every 100,000 people. That is a rate higher than the United States average. And just to give you some context, globally, here in South Dakota, our incarceration rate is even higher than countries like El Salvador, Thailand, Cuba, and our friends over in Russia. I'm glad that joke landed. 75% of women incarcerated in South Dakota are nonviolent offenders, and that's according to our very own Department of Corrections. We know that for many low-risk, first-time offenders, a mandatory prison sentence can increase the risks of future crime and recidivism. It can unnecessarily tear a family apart, hurt future job opportunities, and perpetuate poverty. Having a felony record also puts a lot of obstacles in the way of a person trying to rebuild their lives after they serve their prison sentence. It makes it a lot harder to find safe housing in safe neighborhoods, to get a job, and to reintegrate back into the community productively. We believe very strongly that if we are going to be sentencing people to a term in prison, they should serve their time, and then we should not make it harder for them to become productive members. We've supported over the years a lot of pieces of a lot of pieces of legislation that take into account sort of that nexus. One of the first pieces of legislation that I worked really hard on that unfortunately didn't pass, but it was a bill to restore the right to vote immediately getting out of prison. And I remember in doing the research for that piece of legislation and in my testimony before the committee, obviously as the ACLU we come at it from a civil rights perspective, and we know voting is great and it's important to democracy, but it's more than just fuzzy words, right, and good feelings. Giving people the right to vote when they get out and actually having people vote makes them feel like they're a part of a community. It makes them bought into their system and their neighbors, and it actually correlates with a reduction in recidivism. So unfortunately that bill didn't pass, but I'm hopeful that in the future we start to take approaches like that. We also talk a lot about drug offenses, and though they aren't the only things that lead to overcrowded prisons and the need for new jails, they are certainly a very large part of it. Our state is the only remaining one that treats the ingestion of a controlled substance, which is having drugs in your system, in your bloodstream, as a felony that subjects a person to more than a year in prison. Not only does this law make us an outlier compared to the rest of the country and reflect a tough on crime, war on drugs approach, it also costs us a lot of money. Senator Craig Kennedy, who some of you might know out of Yankton, brought a bill in the 2018 session, so just this past January, February, that would have reduced this crime from a felony to a misdemeanor, and that LRC, so the body that drafts the laws here at the Capitol, estimated that that would save our state over $61 million in state and county costs over the next 10 years. And I want to be clear what an approach like that would be. We are not talking about legalizing, we're not even talking about decriminalizing. People would still face a penalty for using drugs and having them in their system, but it would be a misdemeanor and not a felony. We believe very strongly that you shouldn't be spending years in prison because you have an addiction or have taken drugs. I think fundamentally we haven't learned our lessons from the failed war on drugs. And though there have been some efforts to change our system here in South Dakota, I'm checking my time. 8 minutes, I'm good. Though we have tried to make some changes, right, through state legislation, we haven't gone far enough. And I think we're actually starting to see some threats to the reforms that we have made through that state legislation. I noticed in the past legislative session a really ramping up in our tough on crime rhetoric in Pierre. And a lot of you probably noticed that in the most recent Sioux Falls mayoral election, these tough on crime approaches somehow became part of the dialogue. And frankly, that really concerns me because I think we might be on the precipice of repeating the mistakes that we've made in the past and doubling down on locking more people up. We think very strongly that you cannot incarcerate your way out of addiction or mental illness. Our failure to take that seriously and to look at new ways to invest our resources into prevention and especially treatment adds to the cyclical nature of crime and incarceration and recidivism. We keep doing the same thing over and over, and we're expecting it to change the outcome. You know, I like to say that if the war on drugs worked, if tough on crime policies worked, we would have solved our drug problem in the 1970s and the 1980s. And we have not done that, and it's time to take a new approach. And I do want to be clear that we certainly have policy positions and we have a perspective, but we don't have all the solutions to this incredibly complex problem. But we know that there are paths forward, and we believe that our smart justice approach is really critical to setting up our system for the change that it needs. And that leads us to sort of this moment in time and the big opportunity that we see, especially in the Attorney General's race. I want to repeat my disclaimer that we do not endorse or oppose candidates, and I'm serious about that. However, we do think people should be informed on the issues and where candidates stand on the issues more than just sound bites, but what their actual policy proposals are, and that people should use that information to vote. So we see the Attorney General's race as really a pivotal one. And why we think it's so important is because a lot of people, and not particularly the people in this room, but a lot of people generally misunderstand the role of the Attorney General. They think of our Attorney General as this boring lawyer who argues in court and stays up all night writing legal briefs. And sure, that is a part of it. But the Attorney General has a vast job and an enormous amount of influence over law enforcement in our state, over legislation. They lobby, they train police standards, all of that. And we want to shed some light on that role, and we also want to remind people that the Attorney General is an elected official. You know, you think a lot of times when there are big pieces of legislation or big issues in the state, the governor's office gets a ton of calls, state legislators get inundated with emails, but the Attorney General doesn't get that kind of public pressure. And we think that it's time for that to change because we know how powerful the Attorney General is, and we know that the bottom line is that they have the power to set the culture of incarceration in our state. They play an enormous role, both in their direct authority over their assistant attorneys general and law enforcement, but they also have a lot of indirect influence over states' attorneys. And it's time that they really start working for the people. And those are the basics of how we're approaching this campaign and why. So some of the work that we're doing, sort of the nitty-gritty, is first we've sent a briefing book to every candidate who was running for Attorney General before both conventions. That briefing book laid out our platform and our policy positions and really articulated what we believe and what policies we want them to think about and incorporate into their work if they become the Attorney General. Those policies, just for an outline, are expanding the use of alternatives to incarceration, both pre-arrest before people even get into the system and afterwards. That they should work to end tough on crime approaches to drug users who are struggling with addiction. That they should really make it a priority to work to reduce racial disparities in our state and in our criminal justice system. For example, we know that Native Americans make up about 9% of our state population, but they make up about 33% of our state inmates. That is not because Native Americans commit more crimes, okay? We know that people of color are vastly overrepresented in our system, and our Attorney General needs to make that a priority, figure out why that's happening, and put in place policies to reduce that. We also really want to enhance transparency. We want the next Attorney General to publish data and information on policies and procedures from prosecution guidelines, police-involved incidents, bail recommendations, sentencing recommendations, plea bargaining, and civil asset forfeiture. We cannot judge how well they're doing their job or what they stand for if we don't have access to those policies in an easily found format like their website. Lastly, we really want the next Attorney General to engage with communities across South Dakota like the elected official they are, and particularly those communities that are most impacted by crime. Our system is certainly not perfect here in South Dakota, and I know I've heard complaints about the legislative coffees and their format and Cracker Barrels, but at a minimum, state legislators come back home and they meet with their constituents and they provide public forums where people can show up and interact. The Attorney General does not do that, and they should, especially for the communities that they're focusing on most and that they're locking up most. Now that we know the top 2 candidates vying for the Attorney General slot, we've sent out our Attorney General candidate survey on the issues. We requested that they send those back by August 1st. One of the campaigns has committed to doing that. The other has not yet, but I still remain hopeful that we will get those back. Some of the issues that we're asking about, we saw this sort of as our chance to go in depth and find out a little bit more outside of TV interviews and newspapers and all of that. So we're asking really general questions in some parts. You know, Attorney General is the state's chief legal officer. They set the culture of incarceration. What is your vision for what that culture should look like? What would your top 3 priorities be as the next Attorney General? Do you believe South Dakota incarcerates too many people? Would you advocate for the elimination of mandatory minimum sentences? Do you support drug courts? What would you do to prioritize racial justice issues and make information more transparent? One question that I am really hoping they both answer is related to preserving the criminal justice reforms we already have in this state. Back in 2013 and 2015, our state passed SB 70 and SB 73, which were the adult and juvenile criminal justice reforms. And I think it's really critical to know if the next Attorney General and those candidates supports those reforms, would work to preserve them, and if not, how they envision changing those laws. Again, we're hoping for that to come back by August 1st, and I hope that they both do so that we can continue to inform people of where they stand on the issues. Outside of communicating our views to the candidates, and perhaps more importantly, is that we're really engaging in more public education work than we ever have before, and community outreach. We've recently had events in both Sioux Falls and Pierre, and I have to be honest, we were a little nervous about our event in Pierre, and we thought, you know, if we get 10 to 15 people to show up, we will be so thrilled. And 50 people showed up in Pierre, and we were just gobsmacked. We met with those people, we talked about criminal justice, we talked about the ACLU, and we really saw a level of engagement that we haven't before. And as an employee of the ACLU and as someone who really believes in this mission, that was incredibly energizing for me. You know, we need money to do our work and we need financial support, but I think we're at a point where it is perhaps even more critical to have people who are willing to show up and stand up and speak out and really live a life that enhances civil rights and civil liberties in whatever way that means to them. We're planning a trip to Rapid City in August. We're also working with advocates and activists across the state to bring people together and communities together to talk about these smart justice issues at the beginning of September. We're hosting events all over the state and also trying to take advantage of some digital platforms that is in more meaningful way than just Facebook posts. You know, the reality of our state is that it's very, very big geographically, and our staff is not that big, so we can't be everywhere at once, and so we're really hoping to look into ways we can use digital media and digital organizing to connect people when we know we can't always get on the road. We're also speaking to as many groups as we possibly can, groups like Forum. So if you have a church or a group that you're a part of and you think it'd be worth having us out to come speak, please let us know, because we're really looking to get this information out in front of as many people as possible. You know, we think it's critical for people to know about these issues and be aware of them. And it's really, really critical for them to do that when they're voting. And so as we get closer to the election, we're also going to be focusing on voting rights a little bit more to make sure that people know their rights when they get to the polls and know how to assert those rights. Because the truth of the matter is, if you're turned away from your right to vote wrongfully, you can file a lawsuit, you can file a complaint, but there's nothing you can do to get that vote back in that election. So we're going to be putting together materials and distributing them. And right now we're working on putting together a plan to actually get with people in real time on election day to answer their questions. We've been incredibly fortunate to be able to hire a new staff attorney So that makes it our second official practicing attorney on staff, and they will start, yes, we're very excited. He will start at the beginning of August, so we hope to have him fully on board and ready to answer questions in real time on election day. So all of this work that we're doing is really reflecting a shift that we're seeing both within the ACLU and outside of the ACLU. And I think the way that our work is doing is because it's clear that it needs to in this current climate. We can't just rely on our old methods of lobbying and filing lawsuits, though we certainly will continue to do that. We really are putting an emphasis on connecting with communities and getting out of our office and away from our desks more than we ever have. That's why we're putting a big focus on developing a volunteer program and making it robust. Because like I said, our staff can't get to every event and festival and speaking engagement because we're just not big enough. And to have the reach that we want to have and to educate as many people as humanly possible, we have to have people who are willing to volunteer with us. And that's why I'm so excited that Kaden, our admin assistant, wave to everyone, and our amazing volunteer program coordinator is really kicking butt. She has made it her priority and put an emphasis on making our goal of being more active in the community a reality. So we're looking for volunteers not just to help out at events, but to find ways to advance civil rights and the ACLU's mission in their daily lives. And we want to make it clear that every single person in our community who cares about civil rights and civil liberties has a role to play and has a way to contribute to making South Dakota better for all of us. And we really want to reconnect with the idea that grassroots work is a tried and true way to make our state better. And that's why we are hosting a volunteer training next week in Sioux Falls. That's going to be on Tuesday, July 24th, both taking place at the downtown library. The first session is 12 to 2 p.m. and the second one is 6 to 8 p.m. If that sounds like something you are interested in or you have questions about it, please touch base with Kaden at the end of forum today. She can answer your questions. And she has the sign-up sheet. We do ask that you sign up, just so we know how many people are coming. So you can do that today, or you can email southdakota@aclu.org.
Can we pass the clipboard around?
We can. What you'll learn at this 2-hour training is a little more background about the ACLU and what our work looks like, but also big and small ways to contribute, big and small ways to volunteer, and also training for our Legal Observer program. So that'll be the second hour, which I think is really critical to real-time covering civil rights events that happen.
Our Minnehaha and Lincoln County candidates have formed a coalition, so we meet regularly. To me, it would make sense if you give us a primer on what steps we can take as we are knocking doors and talking with our constituents about know your rights. And if there's something brief you could throw together that we might be able to disseminate as needed, and at least a reference guide should we have questions, I think that would be a good next step for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you can only assert your rights if you know what they are, right?
And Jeff Hayward and Scott Peterson.
Jeff is my brother-in-law. Full disclosure. Yeah, absolutely.
Is this question and answer period, or were you finished?
Almost. No, you're fine. Actually, yeah, that was basically the end. Volunteer training, passing that around.
Then I have a question.
Yes, please do.
I have a hypothetical. You said South Dakota.
Am I in law school?
Yeah, okay. You said South Dakota is the only state that has an ingestion. You can be held accountable legally if they find something.
We're the only state that classifies it as a felony. We have some disagreement with the Attorney General currently because he claims that we are not the only state. I think he is wrong. We are the only state that treats it as a felony and has the formulation that our state law does.
Okay, I have a hypothetical.
Okay.
Let's say an individual, a working individual, on the weekend, does a little marijuana, gets high, sober when he goes to work on Monday, but his boss all of a sudden springs a urinalysis test. They find out, because marijuana stays in the system much longer than alcohol does.
Marijuana is not part of the ingestion statute. It's treated differently under state law, but every other drug is covered.
Well, let's just switch it to cocaine.
Yeah.
Okay, does a little cocaine, gets high. Monday, he's sober. He has a urinalysis test. They find it. can the employer call the state? Could he be arrested and jailed?
I mean, ignoring all the other issues that are part of it, yes, because with the ingestion, the test is not how much do you have in your bloodstream, it's yes or no. So if the test is positive, if it's in your system, then you could be prosecuted for that.
And I would imagine a woman who's delivering a child has a blood test, and if they determine, God knows when she might have done the drug, and maybe one time.
If it's present in her system, then
They
yes,
could probably take the child away from her and send her to jail.
it's possible.
Our legal system basically has three means of addressing illegal activity: fines, incarceration, and execution. The last two are terribly expensive, but we don't seem to have any. Well, we have kind of a constitutional problem, and punishment can't be cruel or unusual. Punishment by definition is cruel, and if it's new, it's by definition unusual. So we have kind of a difficulty coming up with anything else. Is anybody working on some kind of other, less expensive method of dealing with illegal activity?
I think, yeah, I mean, there are ways that we are looking at and that people within the system are looking at it. But I also think kind of a bigger picture approach is the role of the criminal justice system and why we're incarcerating people. You know, I'm going to go in the way back machine to law school. One of the things we talked about in my first criminal justice class was what is the purpose of criminal law? What is the purpose of prison? Are we trying to rehabilitate people? Are we trying to punish them? Or are we putting them in prison to keep the rest of us safe? And I think that we really have to look at punishment and think about why we're punishing people and to what end. Because I think that there are a lot of people doing things that may be illegal, you know, not lawful, that really shouldn't be and that don't deserve punishment because of all the chaos that it wreaks.
I'm a chaplain in the prison system, and the biggest difference between the men's facility and the women's facility is the men's facility has tons of different kinds of jobs. They have a huge library, and they have all sorts of activities and religious groups and things like that. The women's prison has nothing. 60% of their library is not even the size of this half of this room. 60% of the literature is just Christian books. And there are no activities, and there's 2 jobs in the entire facility. There's very little for these women to do. So while they're there dealing with their nonviolent offenses, they have nothing empowering them, therefore increasing their recidivism or their dependency on these things when they get out because they're traumatized from being within the system. And I'm wondering, what can we do to change that?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of things. One, make that a problem for the Attorney General. You know, make sure they're getting letters and getting emails and getting calls. I know, you know, our DOC commissioner or Secretary of the Department of Corrections is not an elected official, but they have an email address and they are a state employee. And that's one thing, you know, we're really interested, our staff, in women's issues and women's incarceration particularly, and the idea of what happens when you take a woman who tends to be a primary caregiver of children out of the equation and the ripple effect that has on her family and her children in schools, and really looking at better ways to address this. Because if we don't stop locking people up at the rates we are, we're going to have to build a new women's prison. And I don't think we should be doing that. I think you had your hand up and then I'll go back to you.
We're having a little discussion right now in our press about the upcoming school election here in Sioux Falls. And in the last year in the school election, we went and used what they're called super precincts. But all the precincts for voting were in the south part of town. There were none in the northern part of town. And wanted to know if the ACLU would have any interest in looking into that. And we also have learned lately that the school board is planning to have this $300 million vote. And they're going to be probably hand counting all the ballots. Mm-hmm. We've also learned in the past, I do a lot of work with voter data, and have discovered that not all of the votes appear to be counted. and they're not registering all of the voters who have voted,
Okay.
or at least tried to vote. And there's a whole series of issues with the way the school is running their elections. And would like to know if the ACLU, I'm not putting you on the spot.
Yeah, no.
But
So
I
I'm going
would
to give you my
like to-
lawyer answer, which is it depends, and I would have to research it.
Yes.
You know, local election laws and municipal election laws we found in the last election can be a little tricky because they're run under a different system. You know, we actually got several complaints about absentee ballots that were sent out to people really late, and then people had to pay to overnight them from wherever they were living, and there was the possibility, you know, if you didn't pay, it wasn't going to get here on time and your vote wasn't going to be counted. So we are looking into those issues and doing some research on that, but I'd be happy to put that on my to research pile and see if there's,
I'd like
What,
to,
you know.
I'd like to talk to you about that.
yeah, absolutely.
I was actually part of the committee of 7 that, and I was the chairman of the election review committee in 2014-15 that at least got the voting to be consistent again when we were using the state assets and the county assets for the election. Now we have a situation with this election where we're going to be probably using the already failed intercivic e-poll books that
Okay.
failed out in most of the state.
Yeah,
And they haven't, Hart no longer supports the equipment, and we don't know how BPRO is going to be able to actually make the system work for the school board so that we can actually have a somewhat legitimate election.
yeah, absolutely. I don't know anything about that offhand, but
I'll
okay.
gladly fill you in.
Okay, perfect. Other things?
NPR had a program on, I just happened to hear. It was talking about the wait list for disabled individuals in the prison system that are entitled to release, but are held beyond their release date until appropriate transition housing or placement in the community can be made. How in the hell are they keeping people incarcerated who have served their sentence time? I have never heard of such a thing, and we came from Missouri, and that did not happen
Yeah.
in Missouri, I can tell you that right now. So I had never heard of this. So not only are you having a discriminatory practice, unlawful in my opinion, but being discriminated against because you're a disabled person, meaning wheelchair, or one of the diagnoses was depressive disorder. I've never heard of such a thing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I have learned through this work is that the government does a lot of things that they shouldn't be doing.
Doing that in-
I don't know. I have not heard of that happening here. But it reminds me of a related issue, which is the mental health competency delays, which is you've been arrested, you know, you've been indicted, you're going to go on trial, but you have to be competent to stand trial. And there was a big issue happening where people were waiting 3, 6, 8 months plus a year because the Human Services Center in Yankton was only doing 3 of those a month. Thankfully, this became a big issue and it kind of got into the public consciousness, and there was a task force formed, some laws were passed, and my understanding is that they're doing better now and they're getting people in. But what was so frustrating about that situation is that you have a right to be competent at your trial, right? And you haven't been convicted of anything yet. So you're being housed in a jail, which is not a mental health facility, awaiting the state to give you a service that they have to give you before you can go to trial. And so part of the time, when it comes to these sorts of issues and the things that are happening, it takes a whistleblower, it takes someone to bring attention to the issue, and then either the government gets its stuff together or we sue them.
Bail is, I'm sorry.
Oh no, you're fine.
No, bail is kind of an interesting issue now with Paul Manafort being in a VIP a jail. You know, I thought the 14th Amendment talked about equal protection of the law. And my guess is that if you're poor, you basically do hard time while on bail.
Yeah.
You can't make your bail, so you go to jail. You're not getting any privileges. But white collar crime gets VIP treatment.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the bail system is also set up in a way that is favorable to people with money and not favorable to people who don't have money. And our position is that when it comes to bail and being released pre-trial, You should only be incarcerated if you're a threat to the public. You shouldn't be sitting in prison because you cannot pay to get out pre-trial. So our bail system is...
It seems to me too that if Paul Manafort had to go to the jail like everyone else, he'd probably be more happy to flip on the president than going to a VIP jail where he's got internet and...
Yeah. Regular jails are not like that, I can tell you that.
I just wanted to say, I can't speak to the situation we're talking about. In our chaplain's meeting 2 weeks ago, everyone's aware of the law that passed about the compassionate release. There's a guy who's terminally ill, life sentence, murder one, and he's dying. He's got a couple of months left, so he's getting out on this compassionate release. No hospice in South Dakota is willing to take him, even in his critical state. So they've had to house him, even though 3 months ago he got approved for this because no one is willing to take him. So because the law pushes them to remedy this, he is going to be paroled to his mother's house in California. So now they have to go through transfer papers and all sorts of extra paperwork that's taking that long. So by the time this actually goes through, he already will be dead. So yes, there is a complicated thing there with people with disabilities. But that also speaks to the situation of recidivism due to a lack of finding work as a disabled worker. As a disabled worker, you have more likelihood of getting a job as a blue-collar worker with a crime than you do as someone with a disability and going out and trying to find work.
Both physically and mentally,
Yes.
the whole spectrum.
Yes.
I have a question. A couple weeks ago, I was over at the park where they did the protest for the kids that were put in cages. And I got a button from the ACLU that says, "Let dreamers dream."
Yes.
Now, I live 120 miles away from here on an Indian reservation, and I don't think an ICE officer would be safe down there. But is there any activity that you're aware of ICE in South Dakota, and have people been taken out?
ICE is definitely in South Dakota. There are agents that live here and work here. They're all out of the Minneapolis is sort of the hub, but they definitely are here. We haven't directly gotten complaints about any raids or anything like that, or we're unaware of any that are happening, but that doesn't mean that people are not being deported every day.
Are the dreamers right now?
They should be fine.
In a limbo of protection?
Right now, there are several lawsuits going on, and it's pending. Dreamers should not be being deported right now, but I would say there is not a good solution in place yet, and Congress needs to do something about that.
Just laugh right now.
Yeah. Any other questions? It looks like it's about 12:56.
She talked about drug prohibition being a failure and resulting in mass incarceration. But I don't think drug prohibition was ever set up to promote public safety.
I don't think it was either. I mean, alcohol is legal, and that causes plenty of problems, doesn't it? I don't disagree with you there. All right. Thank you all for having us. We really appreciate it. Volunteer with us if that's your thing. Oh, and if you want to learn a little bit more, just basics about the ACLU, we have pamphlets back there. And we also have these super cool buttons that say "People, Not Prisons." And I love them, so if you want one, take one, please.
We don't come up here to entertain you. We come up here to inform you.